This service is the third that SowCo develops added to our company's product offerings, and our work employed under this umbrella varies widely. For example, 2 separate case studies both involved setting up a remote working environment for collaboration for 100% of company employees, but there were nearly opposite requirements regarding what was allowed, and this resulted in 2 different sets of solutions, even though the end result of having a remote working environment was the same. While I will refrain in this case study from going into most of the more technical setup for each client, I will expound on the solutions implemented that entail more non-technical user applications for collaboration. This will give insight into what solutions SowCo develops implements based on varying requirements from small companies. The first scenario was the less complicated of the 2. The requirements were that the applications and tools implemented must be simple for a small team and therefore primarily only include modules that were anticipated to be used by the team and be tools that allowed the team to move forward and make progress. The company desired uncomplicated onboarding, uncomplicated management of the application, and uncomplicated user operation. They wanted the tool to do their work immediately and not spend a tremendous amount of time managing or troubleshooting or trying to understand the tool itself before they could get work done with the tool. So in other words, this company's priority was to avoid unnecessary headaches and unnecessary time invested in the application itself. They wanted an application that worked out of the box and that did what it was promised to do. More often than not, they preferred to use applications that were hosted by another company because they wanted customer support included in the use of the application. Again, the motivation behind this was to spend as little time as possible on ancillary support of applications by their staff and instead free up their staff's time to work on their company's product. Their requirements for customer service was that the vendor was responsive and adequately served the needs of the users. This client was just beginning and therefore did not have a tremendous budget for applications. In most cases, they could afford starter to mid-level plans offered by vendors for only a few applications. So SowCo Develops was required to find vendors who offered good customer service with reasonable, affordable rates for the small company. Since the client could only afford a few applications, it was also important that SowCo Develops identified an infrastructure of applications that accomplish the totality of the environment with only a few applications. The application vendors themselves were also a factor. They had to be a known company with a good reputation, who had shown themselves to be trustworthy, who was on the market long term, and who had demonstrated that they had good privacy practices with the client data that was in their possession on their servers. The vendor could not be sticky with the data or product, and if it could be avoided, the client preferred to not deal with the type of vendors that have retention specialists trying to talk them out of leaving if the client desired to leave in the future. So in other words, if the client wanted to discontinue use of the product, they wanted to have a vendor that made this process easy, no questions asked, and had tools in place where the client's data may be easily, accurately, and responsibly extracted in its entirety and in an easily usable format to be imported somewhere else. Regarding solutions that met the requirements for this client, they worked on Apple computers and they wanted their file system for documents that they actively used to remain on iCloud. So per their directive, we kept that system as is. They used DigitalOcean for a variety of solutions in their development environment, and they enjoyed the centralization that DigitalOcean provided. Therefore, for their documents that were not actively used, but that were required to be retained for record-keeping purposes, in order to minimize the cost of iCloud storage, we set up all archive documents in DigitalOcean Spaces Object Storage. We installed Basecamp for project management and the majority of internal communication. Basecamp was home base for all projects and used for company-wide announcements, group discussions, and informal chat, and to assign and track tasks, set up schedules on the calendar, brainstorm, share and discuss files, status, and policy, and make on-the-record decisions. This was a centralized tool conducive to keep all of these functions together in one place with one low application cost managed by a well-known responsible vendor, 37 Signals. We set up a company email and calendar applications to be hosted by 37 Signals Hey because the client appreciated the design and features. Video conferencing was rare for the client, but if it was needed, then Zoom was employed for the occasional conference. The meetings were typically short and to the point, so Zoom's free tier sufficed. Finally, for their customer support suite, we installed Zendesk and a discourse community forum. Zendesk allowed the client to centralize customer support in one place for voice, social, email, and chat channels, and these channels were sufficient support for the client's need at that time. Then the community forum offered support to customers in a different format for their convenience and functioned as a resource bank for customers seeking solutions for the client's product. Solutions for documentation was customized according to need. Based on the need of the documentation and the audience, it was either developed in application such as pages or numbers, then converted to a PDF and stored in a centralized bank in the file system, or it was developed as a simple browsable online book managed in a Git repository. Regarding password management, the customer already had a solution in place, LastPass, and they were firm on keeping it in place, so we left this as is. Finally, the client desired an inexpensive, non-smart, absolutely basic mobile phone with talk and text capabilities only in order to utilize it as the primary company phone number. There was a company phone number given through Zendesk, however, it only offered talk, not text. Zendesk did offer a plan that included text, however, it increased the cost of Zendesk significantly. Being that the only gain desired by the client was text, we looked into other options. The solution for this was to purchase a plan through Tello that included no data, 100 talk minutes, and free text. This solution was an affordable $5 per month. In the second scenario, requirements were stricter. The client required that only open source applications be used. That also included a free plan so that at least during the initial setup of the company, they would not be paying fees for the applications. If a required service did not offer a free plan, then the client required that the cost be significantly lower than the majority of the market. They required open source applications because they wanted two things. First, they wanted their company information on their servers only for security and confidentiality purposes. Second, they wanted to ensure that the backend program and database infrastructure was accessible for ease of access, manipulation, and export on demand. For this client, lean time was employed for project management and scheduling. Therefore, all company tasks were assigned and tracked in lean time. Rocket Chat was employed both for internal communications and customer support. For internal communications, chat was set up by department, and conference calls and screen sharing were all done in the application. For customer support, Rocket Chat channels integrated included social direct messages and chat from the client's website widget. NodeBB also was employed for customer support as well as easy appointments for customer appointment scheduling. The password manager was entirely custom built by the owner and placed behind the client's authentication system. SowCo Develops was tasked with QA of that manager and assigning and overseeing improvements when required. For documents in the file system, the client wanted everything in applications on their servers. As a result, documentation was distributed in three primary applications: Outline, Lean Time, and the NodeBB Community Forum platform. Which documentation was placed where was based on the function and audience. The client was using Backblaze by integrating it with their CDN to serve content, so it naturally followed to also use Backblaze buckets for file archival from the various applications on which they stored their documentation. Part of SowCo Develops' work with this client was to manage these applications and ensure that they all work together as intended with the client's operations. In addition, for the first client, SowCo Develops was responsible to implement the human resource systems of payroll, compliance, performance, expenses, and onboarding, including development of employee policy and procedures and subsequent documentation of the employee handbook. We also were tasked with development of compliant privacy and cookie policies and terms of service and publishing of that content, development of a records management application, administering domain registration, the domain name system, and the company email delivery for marketing and mailing lists. For the second client, we were also tasked with QA of the client's website and user application, performing minor updates and tasking and overseeing the larger updates. We were required to oversee the mail servers that were installed by the client alone, troubleshoot email deliverability problems, and put automation in place in every area possible. A core value for this client was that as much as possible be automated so that employee time would not be tied up doing manual tasks that were unnecessary. Then another key reason that this client hired SowCo Develops was because they needed a backup to know the application and the business so that they were not the only people who knew how to run it. They started out being the only ones who knew how to run the system and the company, and this hindered their growth and limited the amount of support they could give to their customers. They brought in SowCo Develops in order to solve this problem. For both clients, SowCo Develops was responsible for administering servers, including putting load balancing and proxying solutions in place, administering the content delivery network, and monitoring uptime. Finally, we were required to document processes, systems, and standard operating procedure company-wide. In conclusion, these two clients give a good overview of SowCo Develops work that we do for the small business technical infrastructure services.